Today we'll be looking at the business cycles, which is part of a section of macroeconomics that you are currently doing. Right, in our introduction, we see that the economic activity as shown by real GDP fluctuates every year. These fluctuations are then referred to as business cycles. So when you're asked to describe the business cycle or you have to do a business cycle essay, your introduction would be this kind of description. The business cycle shows the long run fluctuations of real GDP over time. Right, the important thing that you need to know here are the terminology that is used for business cycles. So here's a set of statements given, and for each of these statements, you've got to recognize what the correct economic term is. So this is a term used to measure trends in the economy, example GDP. I just said that, or that was just explained to you within the introduction. So that obviously is the description of business cycles. Economic activity is at its lowest, deepening of the recession. So that point where economic activity is at its lowest, which is also known as one of the turning points of the business cycle, that obviously would be the trough. A negative economic growth for at least 2 successive quarters, that is now in a nutshell describing what a recession is. The point where the economic contraction is at its lowest is the same as where the economic activity is at its lowest. So that would be your trough once again. And then the point where the economic expansion is at its highest, now you've got the topmost turning point of the business cycle, which is known as the peak. And then what illustrates the relationship between unemployment, this obviously is done by the Phillips curve. Right, so let's just have a look at this diagram for the business cycle. So you've got your real output or your real GDP on the y-axis, and then on your x-axis you've got time, because remember we said the business cycle shows the long run fluctuation of real GDP over time. So there you've got your real GDP, and here you've got time. So with real, why do we use real GDP and not nominal GDP? Because remember, we do make a discrepancy between real and nominal GDP. Real GDP is when inflation has been accounted for, and GDP, so the real GDP is used to measure economic growth, which is directly linked to the levels of productions. And the fluctuations that we're talking about, like your expansion and your contraction, these are also referred to as upswings and downswings, which we will see later on at the end of this session, another graph showing that. And then when we look at the time relates to the number of months or the number of years. Right, when we look at the various phases of the business cycle, so just to go back, so from here up to the trend line would be one phase. From the trend line up to the peak would be another phase. From the peak down to the trend line, and then from below the trend line to the trough will also be. So that will give you your 1, 2, 3, 4 phases of the business cycle, and then it starts all over again. So let's just have a look at those phases. You've been introduced to this in grade 10, but just a quick recap. When we look at the recovery phase, and that is now the phase that is from below the trend line, like from the trough up to the trend line, right? From the trough up to the trend line, that would be your recovery phase. So with the recovery phase, we find that the level of economic activity starts to increase, and the reason that economic activity starts to increase because there is a greater demand for goods and services. And because there's a greater demand for goods and services, that means the production will have to increase to satisfy that demand. And as a result of this increased production, more jobs would then be created. And obviously, with all of this happening, businesses are now gaining more confidence in the economy, and they are looking at expanding their businesses. So we see even further increased economic activity, and then the country will enter a period of prosperity. And this period of prosperity would run from this trend line up to the peak. That would give you, so your recovery phase plus your prosperity phase together, they would form your upswing or your expansion of the economy. So the next one we're going to be looking at is that prosperity phase now. So during the prosperity phase, we find that there's a great degree of optimism in the economy. Entrepreneurs borrow more money to buy machines and equipment, because remember, they're expanding their businesses, and they have to expand their businesses because there's been an increase in the production levels, and as a result of that, there is a rise in salaries and wages. And because consumers are earning more money, their spending then also increases, right? And because people have extra money that they can spend, and they can access loans easily, we find that imports increase because now they can afford to buy those goods from outside the country and pay whatever costs there is. And this will carry on until a peak is reached. And if you look at where that peak is situated, if you look at where that peak is situated, after that peak, we see a drop or contraction starting to take place. So what happens there is, at that peak, there is a larger amount of money in circulation, which is obviously going to lead to an inflationary situation. And remember, if you think of what inflation is all about, it's about the increase in prices. And one of the things that government is very strictly on is that they want stable prices. They don't want these high price increases. So with all of this money in circulation during the prosperity phase, it leads to an inflationary situation, which will then cause a contraction phase to get started. And obviously, when there are 2 consecutive quarters of economic growth, that is when we know now we are now in a recession. And a recession is introduced by a decrease in profits of businesses, and the reason businesses' profits decrease is as a result of inflation. Because as you know, the law of demand says as prices increase, people will buy less. And because people are buying less or fewer goods and services, they can't produce the same amount, so they also have to adjust the production levels, so therefore fewer goods and services are produced. So now this gives rise to a feeling of pessimism. Remember, we had in your recovery phase a feeling of optimism. In your recessionary phase now, we have a feeling of pessimism, where people are finding, we've got to look after what we've got. We're not sure what's going to happen in the future. So they don't spend as much anymore. So consumers tend to save more during this period. So therefore spending declines, and with the spending taking down, we see there's a slowdown in the economy as a result of less production taking place, and the fewer production is taking place because the demand has gone down. The other reason the demand has gone down is because during this period, households and firms obtain less credit and loans from banks because they don't want people spending money, because they're trying to get a hold on the inflation that exists. But if this is not watched, your recession phase could turn into a depression. And once again, to get back to the graph, the depression phase is obviously from after that trend line down to the trough. That would constitute your depression. So what happens during a depression phase? We find that money is in short supply, this causes a negative impact on investment spending. And then I'm talking about investment spending from both the government as well as businesses. And then eventually a trough will be reached. And then we find that there is competition for employment opportunities, cost of production decreases, and this then now again encourages foreign trade. And with that foreign trade being encouraged, we see an increase in demand, and now we start the process all over where you move into a recovery phase, then into a prosperity, and it will just all happen again. Now, the reason that business cycles exist, a first one that we're going to look at are the exogenous factors, right? And if you think of the word exogenous, it is something similar to saying that it is external. So anything outside of the market situation, anything outside of the market, these are the factors that is going to impact on the economy. So it's going to cause the business cycle. So examples of this intervention from outside is your government intervention, shocks, as well as wars, right? So the school of economists who follows, or the economist who follows this school of thought, they are also known as the monetarists, and they believe that the market is stable and you don't need any outside intervention. They believe in the invisible hand theory, where they say that your market forces of demand and supply will fix any problems within the market. So therefore, you don't need government to intervene at all. And then another reason we have are the endogenous factors. And the economists who follows this school of thought, they believe that government intervention is necessary because they say the markets are unstable and demand and supply is not enough to correct the problems. So therefore, you have to get the government involved in the economy to rectify. And the way they get involved is obviously through the various policies which they employ and implement. The types of business cycles that we get, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. There's the kitchen, which lasts about 3 to 5 years, and this is with regards to inventory levels, whereas your juggler lasts about 7 to 11 years, and this deals with the net investments, and your Kuznet cycles works from a 15 to 20 year span, and this we find within the construction industry, and then the Kondrativ, which is plus 50 years, and this we find within the technological sphere of businesses. So you need to know the 3 different types. You need to know kitchen, juggler, Kuznet, Kondrativ. So if you remember them in that order, then you know kitchen is the smallest amount of years, which is 3 to 5. Juggler comes next, which is 7 to 11. Kuznet is 15 to 20, and Kondrativ is plus 50 years. Very popular 2-mark question, or not popular, but a possible 2-mark question where they can say either list 2 types of business cycles, or in a section A, they can say which of the following business cycles refers to inventory levels, or which one is found within the construction industry, etc. Right, then this is now the essay question for this section, which is on the new economic paradigm. Something a lot of students struggle with and can't really get to terms with. But you've got to understand the word paradigm. The meaning of the word paradigm means you have a shift in how you see things. It's a mindset change. So when we talk about the new economic paradigm, we're talking about the shift employed by government. So instead of concentrating on fine-tuning the economy, government is moving away from that, and they're rather going for inflation targeting, because governments nowadays are realizing that yes, there is way too much intervention from government side. These monetarists actually had something, or they knew what they were talking about when they said governments shouldn't get too involved in the markets. So in South Africa, our inflation target is between 3 and 6%, and currently we are outside of this bracket because our inflation rate is greater than the 6%, right? And therefore, we will see in the next slide what government is doing to fix this problem. So another objective, as I said, of government is the stability of prices. So they need to control the whole inflation situation. And in order to do that, they use the demand side and supply side policies in order to increase the output or get the economic activity going. But at the same time, they want to maintain the price stability. So they don't want to see prices increasing drastically, but they want to see demand increasing as well. But at the same time that they're encouraging demand to increase, they're also encouraging supply to increase, because if the two move together, we can then not have the price increases happening. Then we can get to price stability. Right. So with your demand side policies, so when the economy is depressed, right? When the economy is depressed, they will use the fiscal policy in order to stimulate that. And the tools of your fiscal policy is government spending and taxation. And remember, we are now getting ready, the end of February, we're going to hear Enoch Godongwana, who is our Minister of Finance, and he is in charge of the fiscal policy. So we're waiting for his budget speech, which is going to explain to us how government intends spending the taxes that they expect to collect for this year, right? So he's going to lay out his plans. So that would be your fiscal policy. But when they are trying to dampen an overheated economy, then the monetary policy would be used, and this is the governor of the Reserve Bank, Mr. Lesatya Kaganyago. He is in charge of this policy. So him, together with his monetary policy committee, they meet every second month to have a look at what they're going to do in order to target this inflation problem that we are currently having. Because remember, like I said earlier, at the moment, our inflation is outside of the target of 3 to 6%, right? So you would have heard last week, Thursday, they met and they increased the interest rates by a 0.25 basis points, meaning 0.25% it had gone up. The reason for that is they are now ensuring that consumers don't have as much money to spend, because they're trying to get that inflation rate to come down. But other tools that they also use are the cash reserve requirements, the model persuasion, as well as open market transactions, which you would have done in detail in grade 11. This is merely just to remind you what the tools are within each of these policies, right? Please, fiscal, taxes and government spending, monetary policy, interest rates, cash reserve requirements, model persuasion, and open market transactions. Right, so you cannot implement only demand side policies. You can't just work on increasing demand without looking at supply or taking the supply side into consideration. So the first thing here we've got is that they could improve the efficiency of markets. And the way in which they can improve the efficiency of markets is by means of deregulation, competition, or leveling of the playing fields, right? So when we speak about the term deregulation, it is the removal of laws and regulations, right? So government will take away some laws and regulations to make it easier for businesses to operate within the market. Competition, they will encourage competition, right? So they will encourage new businesses to open up. The leveling of playing fields, as you know, your private businesses cannot compete with the public sector. So obviously, government steps in to ensure that they make that here the main thing is about privatization, getting less stuff in the hands of government or where public funds have to be used and letting private persons take that over. So when you're talking about leveling of the playing fields, privatization becomes important. Then another way of seeing supply side policies, there's the improving the efficiency of inputs. And when you want to improve the efficiency of inputs, there are various things that can happen. The first one is looking at the tax rates. So obviously, if people are paying too much tax, if I have to pay too much of my income must go to government, this is going to be a disincentive to work. What we mean by the term disincentive, it means it discourages people from working. Whereas your higher company tax, on the other hand, it discourages businesses from investing, because remember, businesses, what we refer to business investment is when they buy those extra machinery, when they build the bigger plant. But if their taxes are too high and most of their earnings are going to government, they're going to say it's not worth my while, I'm not going to do this, right? Secondly, the capital consumption, replacing of capital goods, create opportunities to keep up with technology and to compete with their competitors. Human resources, the quality of labor, increase the efficiency of business. So by improving your healthcare, your education, and your training, this is how you are uplifting the quality of your human resources as well. And then government also offers free advisory services, and this is especially with regards to the fact that they want to promote exports, so they will do the research on your behalf and collect all the necessary information that is needed by the business in order to stimulate their exports. And then the last one is the reduction of costs, right? And here we're looking at infrastructure services, admin costs, as well as cash incentives. With the infrastructure services, this is where governments are they will supply the necessary roads, the electricity infrastructure, etc., for what is needed for the businesses to operate within a certain area. And at times they will also contribute or help businesses pay for these things. The admin costs, these are the inspections, reports, the implementation of laws, regulations. So all of these things will increase the costs and expenditure of the business. So that has to be kept to a minimum. And then cash incentives, subsidies can be given to businesses when they want to establish their business in neglected areas where unemployment is high. So what they're saying is government can subsidize these businesses, and government does. What they do is when businesses are willing to go into those industrial areas that government is setting up, they will help pay for their relocation costs, or if they are producing for the export market, government is willing to waive some of the import duties and stuff that they have to pay on their raw materials. So there are those that already exist. So just to recap quickly, the demand side policies and the supply side policies. So when dealing with the demand side policies, the main idea here is to stimulate demand, to get demand going. So in order to stimulate demand, meaning you want people to spend money, you need to increase government spending, because government acts as the parent within a country, right? So what the parents do, the kids will follow. So if government spending starts increasing, consumer spending will start increasing, and government will decrease taxation to encourage the extra spending from consumers. The same thing will happen with the monetary policy. They will decrease the interest rates when they want to encourage spending. But currently, what we're having in South Africa is the fact that we are sitting with a high inflation at the moment, so they want to discourage the spending, and therefore these interest rates are continuously going up and up and up. Right, then when it comes to the supply side policies, we've got improving the efficiency of markets, improving the efficiency of inputs, and the reduction of costs. Those three things are your supply side policies. And then, of course, within each of these, you have different things that relates to them. Sorry. Important that you are aware that deregulation, competition, and leveling of playing fields is part of the efficiency of markets, whereas your taxes, your capital consumption, your human resources is part of your efficiency of inputs. And if you look at this, these are the things that affects your factors of production, and your factors of production are your inputs into the production process. And then we have the reduction of costs. Here we're looking at the infrastructure, admin costs, as well as cash incentives. Now, just to show you by means of a graph, and we refer to this graph as the ASAD model, right? Aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Now, please note, here we've got our price and we've got our output, right? That you should know. So this is just a normal demand and supply curve. So we see here's the original demand curve is AD. Your original supply curve is AS. And we find that at point C, the market is in equilibrium. And at point C, your equilibrium price is price level P, and your equilibrium quantity is at Q. So remember, what did we say? We're going to now implement policies in order to stimulate demand as well as stimulate supply. So what happens is, so demand gets stimulated, which means demand increases from AD to AD1. We see the shift in that curve. From AD to AD1, the curve is displaced to the right, showing an increase in the demand. Nothing has happened to supply because, remember, supply takes its cue from demand. So only the demand increases. So in the interim, you're going to find a point F where your equilibrium is now going to move to F, which means if I go from F across to price, which is going to be higher than my equilibrium level P here, which is showing inflation once again. So therefore, if supply stays constant and is not stimulated, all you're doing is you are feeding inflation once again. But if you also stimulate supply, so that your supply is displaced to the right once again, from AS to AS1, what do we find? Your new equilibrium is here at point E, where AD1 intersects with AS1. So what has happened is you've managed to increase the level of the quantity that's being demanded. You see it's moved from Q to Q1, but your price has still remained constant. There's no change in the price. So without putting any supply side policies in place, you would have had a new equilibrium at point F, but because you're stimulating both demand as well as supply, there is an increase in the quantity demanded and supplied, but the price remains consistent. Right, we come to the worksheet questions. We come to the first question here. Explain how fiscal policy can be used to try to improve the supply side of an economy, right? Remember, what did we say? Fiscal policy, you just go back quickly. We said fiscal policy is there to stimulate a depressed economy. So your economy is in a depression, it's in the contraction phase, it's the lower end of the contraction phase, so you're trying to get that economy to start, you want to get that demand going again. So, and remember, what did we say? The tools of your fiscal policy is government spending as well as taxation. So what they're saying is, let's take, for example, that there would be spending on education. So obviously the demand is going to now move, right? And they say here in brackets, note the multiplier effect. I'm not sure if you dealt with the multiplier effect in the classroom as yet, but if not, you will be doing so within the next couple of days. So, with the multiplier effect, what they are saying that as one person's income, one person's spending will become another person's income. So, government is spending on education, causing the demand curve to move out, but also the aggregate supply curve will shift because workers become more productive. Because remember, the more educated people are, the more productive they are. So, with the increase in the production levels, your unit of your labor costs fall. So this will even shift out the AD curve even further, because with this decrease in your labor costs, you become more competitive on the foreign market now, because your costs, your unit costs has decreased, so you don't have to charge as much on the foreign market in order to make your profit. So you can lower your prices, which makes you more competitive on the foreign market. If we look at the second one, how can government use fiscal policy to stimulate the economy? Now, here we're looking at the two, the different tools. We're looking at what happens if they raise government spending and what happens with the decreasing in taxes, right? So let's say they raise government spending. Now remember, government earns their money from the taxes that they get. So by decreasing taxes, they're losing out on an income. But by decreasing taxes, the consumer is benefiting. Because if as a consumer you are having to pay less tax, it means you're coming home with more money. So because you've got this extra money that you're taking home, you're going to now spend more. And so therefore, when government wants to increase their spending whilst they decreasing taxes, they would now have to increase or raise their spending with borrowed money, right? Money that they will borrow from other countries, from businesses, wherever, right? So by doing this simultaneously, they will increase government spending, but at the same time, the consumer spending is also going to increase, which, as we said, demand levels increase. As a result of the demand levels increasing, the production levels also have to increase at the same time. So therefore, we find that this will lead to increased employment, which is once again another objective of government, right? Is increasing employment or decreasing unemployment, something which you will look at in more detail a little later on. Right, then we get to the class discussion. I just need you to look at question 1 very quickly. Factors that originate from inside the domestic economy system are referred to as A, B, C, or D. And now you're probably thinking, but you've given us the answer, you've told us it's endogenous. Yes, but I want to know, you need to think, why is it not A? Why is it not B? Why is it not C? I don't want you to just look at what is the correct answer. You've also got to think of why are the others not correct, okay? So, factors that originate from inside the economic system, right? Remember when I said to you exogenous factors, the word ex, like external, those are things that are from outside. But the statement clearly speaks about things that originate from inside. So it's definitely not exogenous, right? Production has to do with the making of stuff. Where you take your raw materials, you process it, and now it becomes a finished product. That's not referring to production in any way. And indigenous refers to things that belongs to a certain area or certain region, and that's not what that is referring to either. So therefore, the only possible answer we can get here is endogenous. Right, number 2. In business cycles, estimating something known from information that is unknown is called amplitude. Okay, here the answer is extrapolation. Why can the answer not be amplitude? Right? This is one of the concepts that you need to know. So what does amplitude consist of? What makes up your amplitude? So if you just look here, can you see here, there it says amplitude. So from there down to here, that is your amplitude. Okay, so the amplitude measures the difference between the peak and the trough, right? So it's measuring your level of economic activity between your peak and your trough. That is referred to as an amplitude. Okay, they're asking you, okay, we said it's extrapolation, it's not the trend. So if you look at on your graph, this is your trend line going here. That shows you which direction the economy is moving in. And if you look at this particular trend line, it's got an upward trajectory. So it's got a very positive slope. So this is showing growth within this economy, okay? So it can't be that either. And then your moving averages is obviously where you're dealing with your various statistics now. We come to number 3. The peak of a business cycle is characterized by a what? Now there I haven't given you the answer, but we're going to look at where do we find the peak. The peak is the topmost turning point, right? So remember, from the trend line to the peak, that is your prosperity phase. And remember, one of the things that we spoke about in a prosperity phase is we said we've got high levels of inflation because of all the spending taking place. So you're sitting with a situation where you have too much money chasing too few goods, which is what inflation is all about. So it's definitely not A, right? There is definitely not high unemployment because this is where everybody's just spending and buying, and businesses have been expanding and they've been employing more people. So it's definitely not that. And if business are producing more, then definitely your output isn't low. So the only possible answer you can have there is the high demand for credit, right? Everybody is wanting to get the credit. An increase in the, number 4, an increase in the productive capacity of the economy over a specific period of time is called economic growth, right? Because economic growth, how do we measure it? By GDP. What do we need in order to get GDP, or what does GDP stand for? Gross domestic product, right? And as you heard in grade 11, when we did the national account incomes, there were 3 different ways in which we calculated GDP, and we looked at the productive capacity. So whenever you see the word productive or production capacity, that is economic growth. So what is economic development then? Economic development, on the other hand, looks at how well the people are doing. So when you're looking at things such as standard of living, that is going to give you an indication of economic development. Globalization, on the other hand, this is when we have this coming together of the entire world, right? Where everybody's working together with one another, and the main idea behind globalization is obviously the trade that takes place between countries. And whereas contraction is referring to the downward sloping, right? A contraction refers to the downswing that's taking place in the economy, and your downswing consists of your recession and your depression, but also known as the contraction phase. And then number 5, which is the last one, an indication of long-term growth in the economy is referred to as the amplitude, trend line, length, trough, right? The answer there is trend line. I explained to you what amplitude is. The length tells you how long it takes for the cycle to go from this peak to the next peak, or from the one trough to the next trough, right? That tells you how many months or days or weeks. But please remember, the diagram that you see here is not an indication of a typical business cycle graph. A typical business cycle graph would be more like an ECG reading, right? And then your trough is your lowest turning point within your business cycle. Right, so just to recap what we've done today, we've only looked at business cycles. We haven't, the only new thing that you were introduced to was the new economic paradigm, because your phases of the business cycle that you were introduced to in grade 10, but it seems when they get to grade 12, people have forgotten all about grade 10. So just very quickly, if you look at the graph, if you look at the business cycle graph, you've got to remember this represents your real GDP or your level of economic activity, same thing, right? This here is your time, and obviously your length is measured from peak to peak or trough to trough. Your amplitude, on the other hand, is measured the distance between the peak and the trough. That gives you your amplitude. And then your 4 phases. The peak is not a phase, people. It is the turning point, okay? It is the uppermost turning point. So after the peak, we go into a recessionary phase. And if governments work well, they don't have to go into a depression, right? Because remember, once you're in a recession and you don't implement the proper policies, then you will go to a recession until you reach the trough, which once again is not a phase, it's a turning point. It is the lowest turning point. And then from the trough, you will move into a recovery. And from the recovery, you go into a prosperity. And then this uppermost part here, right, would be what we refer to as your booming phase, right? And then you get your next peak again, and then we start all over again, right? So if you look at your various phases here, you can actually see from the graph exactly what is happening. So if you look here, this trough is where things are like, it can't get worse than this. So the only way to move from this point is to go up. So sometimes it's good to be here because there's no other way to go but up. But what is happening during the recovery phase here? We see there's an increase in demand. And because there's an increase in demand, producers have to produce more. They need to take on more workers. So people are starting to earn money, spending. So there is what we call optimism. Spending starts increasing, and it reaches a level when we're in our prosperity phase, right? And then with all the spending taking place in the economy, we have too much money chasing too few goods. So we sit with the inflation problem. And then after that peak is reached here, we find that the economy starts going into a downswing again. And 2 quarters of negative growth, only that constitutes a recession. Or when we see businesses are losing out on their profits for a long period of time, then we realize our economy is now in a recession. But it is possible to move from a recession directly into a recovery. You don't have to go into a depression. Okay? So during this phase, there is a decline in spending. And when you get to a depression, it's just a further decline of everything. And as spending is decreasing, demand is decreasing, production levels start to decrease, so unemployment starts rising. Right. Then we looked at the new economic paradigm, where we looked at the demand side and the supply side policies. And we said with our demand side policies, we look at our fiscal and monetary policies. Your fiscal policy and the tools there being your government spending and taxation, and how they will use that during a depressed economy, whereas your monetary policy, which consists of your interest rates, your model persuasion, open market transactions, etc. Sorry. There they will implement the the monetary policy when the economy is overheated. And when there is high inflation, that shows that the economy is overheating. And that's where we find ourselves at the moment, right? So if we as South Africans don't watch it and not overspend, so we need to pull back so that that inflation can start coming down. Then we looked at your supply side policies, and there were three important things about the supply side policies. It's the improving the efficiency of markets, improving the efficiency of inputs, and the reduction of costs. Those are the most important things. But more importantly, above all of that, when it comes to the new economic paradigm, the major thing you need to understand and be able to explain and draw is the ASAD model, right? It is how you are able to stimulate demand as well as stimulate supply, getting your quantities to move out, but at the same time maintaining the price level, right? But at the same time maintaining that price level. And then just the last point, which I have not shown you on the slides, but I spoke about it at the very beginning in the introduction. We spoke about a Phillips curve, which shows the relationship between inflation and unemployment. And that's the curve I just quickly want to show you now. So, as you know, your graph has two axes. And we have on this side here, we have inflation. And this side here, we have unemployment. And just quickly, I forgot to put in the name. The name of this is the Phillips curve, right? And the main idea behind the Phillips curve is to show the relationship between inflation and unemployment. And your Phillips curve would have this kind of shape, right? That's your Phillips curve. This point here is what we refer to as, so let's call that point A. So point A is what we refer to as natural unemployment. Right. So let's make that 5%, for example, right? So what you can see here, at point B, what we have at point B is that your unemployment decreased. You see, unemployment was at that level, now it's moved to that level there. So there's been a decrease in unemployment. But when that unemployment decreased, we see, therefore, you have increased inflation, not the other way around, okay? It's not the increase in inflation that caused the unemployment, that caused unemployment to decrease. It is the unemployment that decreased that led to an increase in inflation. Because what has happened here is, these people, there's less unemployment, meaning more people are working, so there's more spending taking place. So therefore, we see this increase in inflation. And if you move to, can you see there? And now you can, so you see every time the unemployment decreases, the inflation is moving up. Okay, so every time we see a decrease in unemployment, we can see the inflation moving up. And that is a basic explanation of your Phillips curve and what the Phillips curve is about. So I'm not sure if you've done the Phillips curve yet, but if not, now you at least have the basic understanding. The Phillips curve and the ASAD model, both those graphs are connected to the new economic paradigm. But be careful when you are being asked the essay question on this, because sometimes you need to give the discussion around the monetary and fiscal policy, where we refer to the we talk about the expansionary and restrictive policies, because if you think of the term restrictive, where they want to restrict you from spending money, so they're going to increase your tax and decrease government spending, but expansionary fiscal policy is where they're going to decrease the taxes and increase government spending. And the same will go with monetary policy. When they want to encourage people to spend money, they will decrease the interest rates, because by decreasing the interest rates, it's easier access to credit. But so that would be expansionary. But with the restrictive monetary policy, they increase the interest rates, so it makes it difficult for us to be able to get or to access credit. So just be careful what is being asked. Are you asked to explain the Phillips curve? Are you asked to do the ASAD model? Are you asked to discuss monetary and fiscal policies? And your teachers will explain to you in much more detail once you reach that section of the syllabus. Thank you, Matrix. It's been a good afternoon.